Are we ready to roll out there? Okay. My name is Bill Romeo, and I'm the editor of the Philadelphia Inquirer. And I just wanted to welcome you all here and say a few words about Rod and Trudy. We're really fortunate tonight to have two great journalists with us here at the home of the Inquirer, Rod's alma mater, the Daily News and Philly.com. This has been Trudy's home for 32 years, where she's covered world affairs and written her column World View with datelines from places in Iran, Iraq, Afghanistan, Israel, Egypt, and Cuba. She's about to embark on a major 3-week assignment which will take her all over the Middle East and Europe. There's no one here at the Inquirer, or in Philadelphia really, with Trudy's command of international relations, the people who shape foreign policy here and abroad, and the historical forces that have given rise to the issues that really require our understanding and vigilance. While this has been Trudy's home for decades, it's also the town where tonight's guest, Rod Nordland, got his start in journalism. I was present at the creation. Rod is, by anyone's standards, a native son. In fact, looking out on the crowd, I wouldn't be surprised if I see at least some of his 5 brothers and sisters, along with your nieces and nephews, Rod. Raise your hand if you happen to be related to Rod. The deck is stacked in your favor. But Rod really is a native son. He graduated from Jenkintown High School back in 1968, Penn State in 1972, and joined the Inquirer right after graduation. And it was here in the Inquirer newsroom, or the Inquirer newsroom on North Broad Street, where I first encountered Rod. And even then, Rod had a penchant for finding stories that often turned adventuresome, exciting, and violent. Back in 1973, our executive editor, Gene Roberts, dispatched Rod to the main line where he wanted Rod to cover the schools beat with authority and precision. But within months, as I recall, Rod, you and your partner, Tom Masland, had turned that assignment into an investigative story about the Warlocks motorcycle gang in Delaware County. One night, in the course of their reporting, Masland was knocked unconscious with a beer bottle. The Warlocks slit the tires of the company car, and Rod and Tom had to escape on the rims of the car. Later, Rod was a key staffer in our stories about the meltdown, or the near meltdown, of the nuclear plant at 3 Mile Island. The Inquirer, along with Rod, received a Pulitzer Prize for their work on that story. 2 years later, Rod opened one of the Inquirer's first foreign bureaus. Was it Thailand, Rod? Bangkok?
Bangkok.
Yeah. And the next thing I recall vividly is seeing a wire photo of Rod holding a tiny white flag. And it went all across the world, circulated by the AP. And what had happened was that Rod was on the Thai-Cambodia border, where the Khmer Rouge, an anti-communist forces had gotten into a pitched battle, and Rod was trying to escape with his life. He told me it was the first time, quote, I realized I was mortal. Rod is now the New York Times international correspondent at large and the Kabul bureau chief. He's here tonight to talk about his new book, The Lovers, Afghanistan's Romeo and Juliet. And to moderate the talk, I'm going to introduce Craig Schneider, the President, the Executive Director of the World Affairs Council. Craig, take it away.
Thank you very much. I'm going to not waste any more time in getting to the meat of this, and I'd like to ask Rod to give us some opening remarks, tell us a little bit about the book, and we'll go from there.
Great. Well, thanks very much. This is the third, I guess, World Affairs Council event that I've been at. It's a wonderful organization, and it sort of, in a country that pays less and less attention to foreign affairs generally, it's great to see it's great to see that that groups like this still exist and there are people that are interested and concerned. Am I getting mic'd twice? I think I might be. Can you hear me all right that way?
No, you're good.
Great. Yeah, and I noticed, like, for instance, the presidential debates. I may be wrong, but I don't think they've mentioned Afghanistan once yet, and we have 10,000 troops there. I know it's a clown show, but still, I mean, one of the clowns will be president, and it would be nice if they or at least showed a little bit of interest in this, you know, what is America's longest war ever. And anyway, with that, I'll get to the subject of my book, The Lovers. A lot of people ask me how it came about, and it came about because because I'm kind of obsessive about checking my spam folder. And you know, I'm so old and I've been doing this for so long that I get a lot of email and a lot of spam. Like literally 500 messages every couple of days. So I have to check it every couple of days or it gets unmanageable. And on this particular day in February of 2014, I guess it was, yeah, I saw this message and I started reading it and it was very long, but it was written in English as a second language. It had actually been dictated by a lady to her son who was learning English in high school and not very well. And so it was a little hard to understand. It was really long, and the lady had buried the lead a couple thousand words down. And I don't know why I kept reading it. It was I was kind of compulsive about it. And finally I got to the lead, which was, there's a girl in a shelter here who the judges have ordered returned to her family. And she's going to be taken out and killed. And there's nothing I can do about it, but maybe if you come, you could write about it and draw enough attention to it that wouldn't happen. And it caught my attention because aside from the fact that it sounded kind of dramatic and all, I'd been in Afghanistan at that point for 3 years, and I had been looking for a good honor killing to cover. I mean, good in a journalistic sense, one that I could get access to. Because usually this is a crime that takes place in the privacy of families' homes and in communities that do everything they can to cover it. It's viewed as a proper practice. It's technically against the law, but it's a law that's basically never been enforced. Occasionally they arrest somebody for honor killing, like a father for killing his daughter, or a brother for killing his sister. And there has never been a case where any of those perpetrators have actually been put in jail. So I had kind of been on the lookout for a story like that, and I went straight up to Bamyan, which is where it took place, and where this girl was in a shelter. It's a remote part of the country, hard to get to. There are flights, but they are very infrequent, and in the winter you can get stuck there for many weeks. And so it was a little bit of a risk to invest what could be several weeks in what may not be a story, because whenever you do these stories in Afghanistan that involve social issues, it's very hard to get access, particularly to women. And even when you get access, it's very hard to get them to talk. But we went up and we took a chance, and actually the girl was incredibly brave. The women's advocates who were counseling her said, look, it's your only chance. And she was an 18-year-old farm girl, uneducated, innumerate. She could not even count to 10, and had never seen another man other than a family member and the man she wanted to marry, and had certainly never seen a foreigner. And it was probably the most intimidating experience of her life to sit there with me and be asked to tell me her story. But she did. She screwed up her courage and she told her story, and it was intensely moving, and that she had that courage actually. And later separately, I was able to see the boy that she wanted to marry, and he didn't need any courage to talk. He's a big talker. He loves to talk, and he loves the sound of his voice, and he has plenty of stories to tell. He's a storyteller in a way, and that's how he seduced her. In fact, as her father once said to me, when he was still talking to me before he realized I wasn't on his side, the father said, this boy seduced my daughter with love stories. And that's indeed what he did. They both would admit that. So I did this story, and it was kind of a nice story because I had a lot of access to all sides, which is very rare, and was able to quote her father and as well as the two of them. And I even quoted a little bit of love poetry that he sacred love story, a love sort of Persian, ancient Persian love story that he mentioned, which struck me as so extraordinary coming from, he was also a farm kid with no education and who was illiterate, although he could count to 10. Although when he counted to 10, he counted 1 through 9 and then 0 after 9 because he got his numbers from the telephone keypad. But he's since learned to count a little bit better than that, or a little more, but not much. Anyway, it was a very touching story. People really responded to it, and I started getting deluged with reader mail saying, "You've got to save these people." And I was, cynical, hard-bitten journalist that I am. I just felt like, well, sorry guys, there's just nothing I can do for this couple. Sooner or later she'll get returned to her family. Staying in shelter isn't a long-term solution. And when she's returned to them, as she said herself, she would be killed. She thought she'd be killed even in the car on the way home. They were so violently angry at her because she had the temerity to decide who she would marry and to want to marry somebody who wasn't from her religious sect, who wasn't the same ethnic group, and who wasn't the same race even though he was a neighbor and somebody that she'd known all her life until they grew up, they worked in the field side by side until she reached puberty and then was separated from unrelated males. But they secretly kept a thing going and eventually decided they wanted to get married. So anyway, I thought that would be the end of it, and there'd be another follow-up, which would be a fairly dramatic story about how she got whacked by Dad and his sons, and it happens a lot, and it's sad, but there it is. She surprised everybody. She surprised me especially, and she escaped from the shelter and eloped with him. They got married the next morning, and they went up into the mountains in Afghanistan without any equipment or not even warm clothes in the middle of winter. And actually it was technically spring, but spring comes pretty late in that part of the country. And they had very little hope of getting very far. And it's not a country you can hide very well in. And they figured in a few days, or maybe if they're lucky, a few weeks, they would be caught, and that would be the end of that. But they felt like it was worth it, and it was worth it just to be together for that amount of time. And so her father and family was pursuing them. The police were pursuing them because the father lodged criminal charges against them, kidnapping against him for kidnapping his wife, and against her bigamy because the father had gone ahead and married her after she eloped. He married her to somebody else, which is something you can do in Afghanistan because girls are the property of their fathers, and so the father can go and actually marry the girl to somebody else without her presence or her consent. And technically she has to give her consent, but the father can just say, she gave me her consent, and it's done. So she was thereby technically married to her first cousin, and men can have 2 wives in Afghanistan, but women cannot have 2 husbands. So the police were after her, and I was after her, because now that they were out, there was an opportunity to really build this story into something huge, and I was very aware of that. And I went with a video crew and photographers and the usual entourage that a foreign journalist needs in Afghanistan to move around the countryside safely. And so we were kind of a big road show, and we were about the most visible thing in that part of the country where I don't think they'd seen a foreigner in the last year or two. Fortunately, it's not an area where the Taliban are present, but still, it's a kind of lawless part of the country. And my thinking was that they weren't going to last very long, so I had to move quickly if I was going to catch them and be able to talk to them. And also what we didn't have before was pictures of them together. A lot of the pictures actually are in the book, and they're quite extraordinary pictures. And also videotape of them together, and a chance to talk to them together and ask them, so what about it? Was this really worth it, what you did? Because you're not going to get away. And I did ask them that question. They did say they knew they weren't going to get away, that sooner or later they'd be caught. But they felt that it was worth it even to have a few days. Actually, they had 2 or 3 weeks together. And they too thought that was the end of the story. They weren't even terribly bothered about it. The people, when I caught up to them, they were staying in a house, and the owner of the house had initially been very welcoming, knew what they were about, that they were fleeing their families and an honor killing. but he had heard the police were on their way, and he didn't want to get in trouble, so he asked them to leave. The only way they could leave was to walk out on the dirt road in front of his house and walk down the dirt road, because there was no vehicle, they had no money to get a taxi or a bus or anything. So they had, I think at that point, less than $20, which would not have gotten them very far. So I made the decision that I would intervene and put them in my car and give them a getaway car and give them some money to carry on running and, step out of my role as a journalist and into, maybe a more important role as a human being and do what I could to save this couple. And so I did, and I don't regret doing that at all. I think it's kind of akin to if you're say a photographer and you happen to cross a car accident, what do? Render first aid first, or do you take the picture first? Well, if you're a human being, you render first aid, or at least call 911 or something like that. So I kind of saw it similar to that. But having saved this couple, they were completely clueless and naive. Neither of them had been outside of their little villages of 60 houses or so, and they had very little knowledge of the world. And it was clear that on their own, they just weren't going to get very far, and they needed help. And I ended up with my translator, the two of us ended up abetting their escape at every turn, helping to hide them, giving them advice and counsel. And I didn't really feel that having saved them initially from capture that I could then say, okay, well now it's up to you, you had your shot now. A couple weeks later, just let you, accept your fate, because they would have been caught. And it wasn't just a matter of being caught and thrown in jail or returned to her family in her case. She would return to her family and killed, but before she got to her family, if the police picked her up, which was the likeliest outcome, she would almost certainly be raped in the police station. Because rape in police stations of women prisoners is endemic. It's so endemic, in fact, that rape of police women in police stations happens in 25% of 25% of police women have been raped by their colleagues in police stations. And that's how bad it is. And so that's what she faced, and I didn't really see any alternative but to get involved to that degree. Let me just take a drink of water, a bit froggy voice. So I'd like to read a passage from the book, and then later I'll take questions. I'm sure a lot of people always ask what's happening to them now, and I'm sure we can get to that in questions. But I'll read a passage. In addition to this being a story about, there's one other point I wanted to make about the rape issue that I started on. Rape wasn't even a crime in Afghanistan until 2009. Prior to 2009, it was treated, the victim of a rape was charged with adultery, as was the man who carried it out. And adultery sometimes, if it's adultery with a married person, that carries a death penalty. And it was considered that a woman, since a woman's the property of a man, there's no reason on earth why that woman should be in any place where she could be raped unless she had done something wrong. She should have been in her husband or her father's house and safe from any crime such as that. And that is no longer the law. There is a law that makes rape a crime now. It was enacted in 2009 with a great deal of US and Western pressure. But in many courts in Afghanistan still, that law isn't even imposed and upheld. So anyway, so there's that. So this became a great story about this couple in love on the run, and people were really interested and really kind of engaged in it, and have kind of remained engaged in the story as well. I've never gotten so much reader mail about anything else that I've worked on. But the other thing about this story, and to me, kind of the most moving thing, which I alluded to a little bit when I began, the most moving thing about it is the degree to which this completely uneducated young couple, their romance was informed by the same things that informed the romances of people all over the world, by poetry and a love of language and a love of stories. And they told each other stories that came down to them. Zakia learned stories from other girls secretly when she was 13, 14, 15, they would share these love stories from Persian epics and Persian poetry that they had heard, and often those stories would be kind of recycled in popular music, and they were very well acquainted with them. And because Afghan popular music has not yet been completely supplanted by Western music, their own music has a kind of genuineness and its roots in this Persian culture, which has a wonderful literary culture. And a lot of popular songs, the lyrics are actually Persian poetry, set to modern music and all. So that was such a big part of their emotional life, and that just struck me as so extraordinary. I never thought to discover such a thing, and it was kind of very touching and very moving. I should back up a little bit and say that one of the characteristics of Afghan society is that romantic love is seen as wrong. It's seen as lustful and sinful, and even between husband and wife, it's not something that you should ever have. And so parents choose their daughters' husbands based on everything but romantic love, and based on how much of a bride price they can get for her, what kind of alliance she can make with another family that's politically or economically useful, on everything but love. And mullahs preach against it, and elders inveigle against it, and for all the efforts they make, they can't stamp it out. It's just that most people that fall in love are not really able to act on it, and what was extraordinary about this couple is that they acted for some reason. Reasons that actually, to me, remain a little bit mysterious. So I'll read a passage that kind of talks about that aspect of their story. It's fairly on in the book, actually, and in their courtship, and before they eloped. It was a particularly bitter winter and too cold during that February and March of 2013 for them to connive to meet in the lanes and the frozen fields during the day. Instead, he resorted to secretly visiting her home at night. In those days, he had taken a temporary laborer's job at a construction site, working a night shift that finished at midnight, and he would come over afterward when the lanes were deserted and the homes all dark. There was a walled vegetable garden outside the window to Zakia's room, where Ali would stand and call to her, as quietly as he possibly could, because she shared the room with the other girls and young boys of the family. When she heard him, she would steal out of the house and climb to the flat roof, where she could look down into the garden and they could talk in whispers. The garden was barren in winter. About a dozen leafless apricot and apple trees lined the mud brick walls and surrounded long rows of tilled earth, now frozen hard. In one corner was a pair of ragged bamboo cages in which Zakia's father kept his partridges, used in the Afghan version of cockfighting, when he could afford them. A small brook had been diverted to enter a hole at the base of the garden wall, exiting through the opposite wall. Ali's 2 or 3 a.m. visits to the garden became regular occurrences, even on the coldest of nights. But at first she would not come down to join him. It was dangerous for both of us, he said, and it was so hard. I would wait outside her house sometimes under a rainy sky, sometimes snowing, sometimes so cold she was concerned about me in the bad weather. I was always so frightened, Zakia said, that we would be caught, and so worried for him. On one particularly cold night, Ali stood in the garden, dripping wet from a frigid rain that had turned to icy snow, and recited famous lines from a poem by the 20th century Iranian poet Malik Oshwara Bahar, which have made their way into Afghan pop music. Love is a nightingale pouring out his heart in song for a rose, bearing patiently the stinging lacerations of her thorns. I don't read and write, said Ali, which is why I don't know any real poems by heart, but I love hearing love poems from others and listening to them read by singers. He knew that there was a world out there in which poetry existed independently of music, and he even knew a few verses from famous poems. Songs, however, he knew word for word. Memorizing the words from music was easy, and he did not need to read anything. Often, he wasn't aware of the lyrics' roots in written poetry, not aware that when he recited lyrics without music, he was simply reciting poetry. They were all verses to him, arrows in his quiver. Zakia's favorite singer was Mir Maftoon, an Afghan from the mountainous northern province of Badakhshan, a place more remote than Bamyan. Long before dawn one morning, early in the still wintry spring, Ali recited one of Maftoon's verses to her as she lay prone on the flat roof of her house, her chin on her folded hands, looking down over the edge. Your two dark eyes are those of an Afghan, but the mercy of Islam is not in your heart. Outside your walls, I spent nights that became daylights. What kind of sleep is this that you never wake up? Touched by the verses and by his suffering in the cold and freezing herself, Zakia finally came down to join him in the garden. And so their love story became a love affair, as Ali delicately put it. He would have stayed there in spite of the intense cold on those mornings, but come the first call to prayer, the subh, which came long before any sign of dawn in these highlands, people would start stirring, going to the mosque to pray, or beginning early chores in animal pens and fields. He needed to be well away from her house by then. If someone loves someone, Zakia said, she should have that bravery to do whatever has to be done. For a long time, I was thinking about it and thinking about doing this. And why should I regret it now? That poem moved me. It increased my courage. Those days were so cold and he was coming to meet me anyway, even though I told him not to come. Because the weather was very cold and he came anyway. And then he recited this poem. It was only a matter of time before they were caught. Ali slept in the same room with his older brother, Ismatullah, and his nocturnal escapades did not escape notice. What are you doing? Ismatullah yelled at him. I know what you're doing, and it's crazy. One night, Ali went out at 3 a.m. to meet her. Zakia, John, and I were in the garden, Ali said, and we must have stayed too late because her mother saw us. She didn't recognize me because at night I would wear different clothes. I wore a hat at night, which I never did during the day. He ran for the far garden wall and scampered over it in a bound. Who was out there with you? Sabza, the mother, demanded of her daughter through the window. Zakia replied that she had woken up early to grind flour, and there was a farmer in the garden who begged for bread, so she went out to give him some. It was an unlikely story, and Sabza did not believe her. Come back inside, you dead father's daughter, Sabza hissed at Zakia. Dead father's daughter. The curse cut deep. Of course her father was still alive, but few things were worse in Afghan society than the suggestion that a daughter might have no father to determine the rest of her life for her.
Trudy, if you'd like to say a few words.
Sure. It's just a couple of points that I'd like to draw on from Rod's book and make some comments on. First of all, the practice of honor killing exists way beyond Afghanistan. Afghanistan still is a largely poor rural culture, but honor killings go on across the southern Mediterranean, through the Arab Middle East, and as far as Pakistan and Afghanistan. And they still go on today. And in my experience in covering the Middle East and also South Asia, I've had occasion to have knowledge of, come across, and be horrified by many honor killings. They go on in the West Bank, Palestine, they go on in Gaza, they go on extensively in Pakistan. In fact, there's a short film nominated for the Academy Award this season called Girl in the River by Charmaine Obaid, a wonderful Pakistani filmmaker. And it is about honor killings and about a girl who was thrown in the river by her family and survives. And surprisingly, honor killings go on in families where there are educated people. I still remember a case in Gaza where one of the teaching supervisors at kindergartens run by the American Friends Service Committee, this is a few years ago, but not so long ago, an educated teaching supervisor stood by when her 12-year-old sister was murdered by her brother in front of her, because this poor little girl had been kidnapped by a neighbor. Nothing was her fault, but honor killings, the honor of the family is seen to be besmirched if a girl is accused of improper behavior, even if it is forced upon her, even if she is raped. So that is one thing. This book touches on a very painful and emotional subject that still exists on a broader level than many of us are aware of. The second point that I want to raise is that Rod's book looks at women who are trying to do better by girls, women who run shelters, who work in the Ministry of Women's Affairs in Afghanistan. And this raises a very poignant and touchy issue for me, because the United States in Afghanistan and other places encourages women to stand up, pushes for laws in legislatures which on the books, including in Afghanistan, supposedly outlaw violence against women. But in the end, the United States leaves, US officials leave, and even when they're still there, they don't always, in fact, often they don't, back up the women whom they have encouraged to stand up against such practices. Now, I think these women are incredibly brave, and they want to stand up. I spent some time at a women's shelter in Herat, Afghanistan, and the woman who ran it, her children were threatened. She had death threats against her family. She did it because she wanted to. On the other hand, the US officials and even non-governmental agencies have often patted themselves on the back for the work they have done for women. And that has been one of the hot-button issues raised by US prominent officials, Madeleine Albright, Hillary Clinton, as a source of pride, helping the women of Afghanistan. And yet all too often, in the clutch, the embassy or US officials don't stand behind the women they have encouraged to speak up. And in fact, I think one of the saddest elements in Rod's book, which maybe he'll touch on, is that the US embassy really did very little to help this young couple. Now, they made mistakes also, and so one cannot blame everything on the Americans. But in the pinch, the embassy was afraid of offending the cultural norms of Afghanistan by giving visas to this highly publicized couple to come to the United States. Well, one might ask, if they were wary of offending the cultural norms of Afghanistan, why had they promoted women's rights in the first place? I'll stop there.
That's a good point.
Thank you, Trudy. So I want to ask a couple of questions for both of you that really go to the way in which this story illustrates the larger question of the U.S. project in Afghanistan. So there's one of the comments about your book says that it exposes the abominable treatment of women by a society the United States, in its ignorance, has fought to preserve. So that is a view that's expressed by one of the commentators on your book. Others would describe the U.S. project in Afghanistan not as fighting to preserve the Afghan society, but as attempting, perhaps naively, to transform that society. Which do you think is more accurate?
Really, kind of both things are accurate. The U.S. has invested a huge amount of money in programs to better the situation for women. Certainly, girls' schools is a famous example. And also the Elimination of Violence Against Women Act that outlawed rape, among other things, such as child marriage, only came about under intense U.S. pressure. In more recent years, though, I mean, you mentioned Hillary Clinton. Hillary Clinton famously said once, to a group of Afghan women, "We will never abandon you." That group of women can now not, several of the people in that group cannot get visas to the United States anymore. And I would be very surprised if Hillary says one word about Afghan women in the coming presidential election. She hasn't so far. Her people won't engage on the issue anymore. And that's kind of symptomatic of what's going on in the United States. We want out of that country so badly that the one issue that has a lot of public support, which is trying to save women in Afghanistan from this incredibly barbaric, partly kind of grotesquely transformed society because of so much war, trying to save them is the one thing most Europeans and Americans actually believe in. The rest of everything else in Afghanistan, I get mail all the time from people saying, "Why the hell are we there? Those people don't appreciate us, and they don't share any of our values. What are we doing there?" But when you let's leave. But when you say to people, "Okay, if we leave, like the day after we leave, all the women's shelters will be shut down, the girls' schools will be shut down, and women will be sent back to their houses after they finish killing all the women that went out and worked and so on." And and then people say, "Well, it's not so simple as all that just getting out." Does that answer your question? I've got sort of rambled on there, sorry.
Yeah, I mean, what you said reminds me that Afghan women have gone through this before. And during the period when the Soviets were in Afghanistan, while the Soviet Union did a lot of horrible things in Afghanistan, they also had a very secular attitude towards educating women. Where you can see pictures of women in that era wearing short skirts, bare legs, and women got educated. And then after the Soviets pulled out, came civil war and finally the Taliban. And I still remember I was in Afghanistan in 1999, it was CARE International had a project to feed widows. Women in Afghanistan who didn't have husbands could starve to death. They couldn't get medical care because you couldn't go out unless you were with an adult male. So the widows had to be fed when nobody could see them in a school. And there were women in burqas handing out the food, and I started talking to one of these women in a burqa, and suddenly she threw up the burqa. And she was a PhD full professor from Afghan University who had been forced, after the Taliban came, and never to teach again, to sit in her house and never go out. And now the most thrilling thing, educational advancement, social work, and helping other women, must now be wondering if sometime in the near future, if they can't get a visa to come to the United States or Europe, they're going to be back in a burqa, sitting in their living room, never able to go out the door.
The point that you raised about the Soviet period, you tell a story in the book that people who haven't had the chance to read it, I'd like you to share if you could. The story about the Mujahideen commander Shirzani. Shirzani. And the idea of jihad against feminism. If you could.
Yeah, one of the early stories in Philip Inquirer said actually was Afghanistan, and although no, actually this is after the Inquirer, it was Newsweek. Anyway, I went back for Newsweek and spent some time with the Mujahideen in the late '80s and early '90s, on hiking in the mountains with them, and I was always struck by the degree of animosity they had toward the communists, not for any kind of economic or philosophical or even religious issues, but over their treatment of women. Women were allowed to divorce, they were allowed to work and educate themselves. Some of the most senior women in Afghanistan now were trained by the communists, and women who were like at cabinet minister level and in high positions in the military, what few there are, they were trained by the communists. And that's what infuriated the Mujahideen. And the particular story you're talking about was this guy who was, a very charismatic commander who, while I was with them, had a Russian prisoner, young boy, 18 years old, and that they had taken prisoner, and he was using him as his sort of surrogate rapee every night, and then they decided to have this boy go out on point through a minefield to find the mines by a sort of human mine detector system. And so we sat up all night, and I tried to persuade him to. He wanted my Swiss Army knife, so I said I would trade him my Swiss Army knife if he would not kill this boy, and he said he wouldn't. But anyway, so we ended up talking all night about life and everything else until we sort of resolved this. And he went on about the whole women's issue, and he was actually pretty alarmed to find out that Americans allowed divorce too, because the Americans were financing them. And he thought it was just the Russians who allowed divorce, and that, you know, women in our society worked and they chose their own mates, and if they wanted to divorce their husbands, they could, and so on. And he was quite outraged by that. But they were, they told this one story about widows, and about the Russians had opened, the communists, the Afghan communists had opened a center for war widows. And they were all quite outraged that these war widows had been given soap. And I was really puzzled by this, like, why would that be upsetting to you? And they said, well, the soap is just the beginning. Then they have group showers together, and they use the soap, and they start having sex orgies. And it was like, sounds like the most ridiculous, bizarre thing, but he and all his men were just absolutely convinced that this was, you know, some road to perdition that the communists had brought upon them. And so yeah, there was a brief golden age there, and then the Soviets invaded the country, and I think people saw it in very stark Cold War terms, and saw the invasion of Afghanistan as something very wrong. But for a lot of the communists and socialists who believed in better rights for women, it was a great tragedy all around.
I'd like to ask this question for both of you, and that is, crystal ball. What are we going to be seeing in Afghanistan after the next presidential election in the United States?
Well, I left my crystal ball home, sorry. But it's really hard to say. It could go any number of ways. I think that through the presidential election, they'll want to do as little as possible to sort of shake the apple cart, not pull troops out, not put a lot of troops in, although we already recently increased troops by 500, which is, you know, considering we only have 10,000, there's a pretty big increase. And but a lot depends on how much the Taliban are able to accomplish. And I think that if they are able to threaten large parts of the country, which seems very likely, and take another major city or two, that's going to put a lot of political pressure on Obama to act. And it'll become an issue for the Republicans. Maybe they'll even start talking about Afghanistan in the election. But what long term, it's, you know, I think the prognosis is bleak. The government's weak and it's corrupt, and unless we're willing to, you know, keep a large presence there, I'm not sure that they can sustain themselves long term. But maybe we are willing to do that. I'm not sure that. I think that's politically very difficult. You probably know more about American politics than I do.
Well, I think the interesting thing is that Obama had said he was going to pull all troops out before he left, and he's already changed that. There's been talk about pulling out half of the 10,000 that's still there. As Rod said, 500 new ones have come. And if I were guessing, I would guess that he isn't going to pull out any more before he leaves, because there could then be a debacle before he goes, which I think is not something that he wants. And looking forward, my guess is a Republican wouldn't pull them out, and a Democrat probably wouldn't either, unless it was Bernie, but I don't think Bernie is going to win. Or get the nomination, who knows. But that doesn't speak to the issue of what will happen in the country. And I think one of the many troubling aspects is that you begin to see pockets of ISIS arising. So things could get even worse. But I do think it's unpredictable. The tragedy of Afghanistan, to me, and Rod has seen a lot more of it than I have seen, but the tragedy is that the Afghans, as conservative as they are, I believe, for the vast majority, do not want the Taliban to come back, or let alone something worse. I've been in villages, in areas that are now Taliban-controlled, where the religious leaders, the Qadis, said to me, the Taliban are not Muslim. The way they behave is not Islamic. So I think people wanted something better, but the corruption in the government and the residue of decades of war, the brutalization of society, the breakdown of respect for elders and the old structures, has just created a situation where people don't have the wherewithal to fight back anymore and are alienated in many cases from Kabul. So people are not getting what they want or what they deserve. But I still think it's hard to predict. The only thing I would feel or say is that if the 10,000 troops did leave, I think the downhill slide would accelerate exponentially.
Okay, last question before we take questions from the audience. This is a little bit off topic, but touches on the expertise that both of you have. I want to ask you what you think it means for America's role in a complicated and dangerous world, that there are fewer and fewer newspapers in the United States that are able to have foreign correspondence and foreign coverage. Some argue that social media and freelancers makes up for it. I'd like to hear your opinion, both of you, on the state of America's ability to be informed about these issues in the current media environment.
God save the New York Times. Why don't you go first?
Yeah, well, no, it's really true. I hate to suck up to my management, but they have made a commitment to Afghanistan and to other, covering news in other parts of the world too, to not make any cutbacks. So I have a $2 million a year bureau with 3 American correspondents, 25 support staff. We are 3 times bigger than the next largest news organization in Afghanistan, which is the AP and Reuters and the Wall Street Journal. They each have 1 foreign correspondent. And that's the number we've had for quite some years, and they are absolutely determined not to cut back on that. I mean, they well know they could cut my budget in half, save $1 million a year at a time when, newspapers are struggling, and they just won't do that. And it's extraordinary, but what it's meant on practical terms is, for instance, on this story, when I got that spam, everybody else in Kabul got that spam too, I'm sure. And, I was and I know some of them saw it as well. But I was the only one who was sitting in a bureau with 3 colleagues at a very busy news time. I forget what was happening then, but it was important at the time. And I was able to then take, what could have been 3 or 4 weeks off. It turned out to be just a week because the flights were okay. And no other news organization could have afforded that investment on what was a very speculative story that might not have come off. And that's the kind of things that we can do because of this extraordinary commitment that the Times has to covering foreign news.
What I would add to that is, a year ago, I taught a 1-semester seminar at the Annenberg School over at Penn called Covering the Middle East. And I asked my students, my 23 students, although I knew the answer in advance, how many of you read print newspapers? And of course, not one hand went up. But that we all know, and that's been the case for a long time. The next question, I think, was more telling. I asked, does anyone read the facsimile online? Or do you just put in keywords and read what you're already interested in? And that's the way most of them read. It wasn't that they were looking for what they might need to know. It was that they were only checking the headlines on what they already thought they might have some interest in. I will say that after teaching for a semester, and I don't think I indoctrinated them because I don't think they would have bought it, but I was trying to get them to look at coverage, and we looked at BuzzFeed, and we looked at Vice, and Vox, and Twitter, and lots of websites, and they did come to a conclusion that the kind of information they could get off BuzzFeed, and they came to it on their own, was not what they could learn from reading the Times or some other detailed websites that are read by a small number, but cover things, certain areas in intense fashion. But even though they came to that conclusion, that doesn't mean they're going to subscribe to the New York Times. And so I think the demand is no longer there. There is a demand for the Times. Obviously, we know that online digital subscriptions are increasing, but it's a select audience. It's a self-chosen, self-selecting audience. And for the rest of the country, the information simply isn't there in such a comprehensive fashion unless they want to go to the Times. It's shocking to realize that there really is no other address. And I think even NPR, for all the wonderful work they do, that can cover things in as much depth. And I say this not to advertise the Times, but to mourn the fact that a lot of newspapers that used to have great foreign bureaus no longer have them.
Just one further point to that.
Sure.
You know, increasingly, and the big challenge for the Times, and I think for other newspapers, is to find how to effectively use social media. Because the younger generation now is getting all their news from social media. So like the other day, my daughter, you know, emailed me and said, Dad, that was a great story you did. And I've been on book tour, I have nice stories lately. And I said, what story was that? And it was some story that I'd done 3 years ago that somebody had shared on Facebook. And the Times is working really hard to try to find a way to harness that, because an awful lot of their content comes to people through that medium. And I'll just tell sort of one of my nieces, I won't name her, but one of my nieces, you know, is full of a lot of moral dudgeon, and was very upset about some story that she was reading about on Facebook, and she was very upset that she had not seen that story in the major media. And I said, excuse me, if you look at that post you just shared, it was an article from the New York Times that somebody shared to you. And actually the major media are covering it. And just because you see it on Facebook does not mean that's where it originated, because in almost all cases it didn't. And I think that's actually a good phenomenon. It's just that newspapers need to find a way to channel that and, you know, and get that kind of credit from that generation that maybe they deserve. And also to monetize it so they can afford to continue doing it.
Questions from the audience, please. We have a microphone here. If I could ask people to step up to the mic so that everyone can be heard.
You have me fascinated on the ending.
Can you jump behind the mic? Thank you.
I said you have us all hanging on edge about what are they doing now?
Yeah.
Where are they? Well, I'm buying the book.
Yeah, unfortunately, since the book was written until now, which is, I guess, almost a year between the final draft and the publication of the book, not much has changed. They're still in hiding in Bamiyan. They're safe for the winter, I think, because it's hard to get to Bamiyan in the winter, and it would be hard for her family to get there. They're not in Bamiyan now. It would be hard for them to get there without being noticed, so they're safe for the moment. But nothing really has changed. They haven't found any embassy or government that's willing to take them. Interestingly, I mean, despite all the attention the New York Times stories I did aroused, you know, there were just no government was willing, although lots of them talked to her. And to like follow up on a point that Trudy was making earlier, you know, we make this massive investment in Afghanistan financially. We've put $100 billion into just rule of law programs, and mostly rule of law programs were about rule of law for women and rights for women. But we don't talk about it anymore. We're just not willing to put our mouths where our money is for fear of offending, you know, the host country. And also because they feel like, I think policymakers feel, you know, we need to get out of this country and not further entangle ourselves in these very difficult social issues. And so in the case of Zaki Ali, they were kind of victims of this reluctance to get involved and to challenge cultural conservatives, and you know, on even such a fundamental issue as a woman's right to choose her own husband, which is a right actually in Afghan law too. So yeah, that's kind of where things stand now.
Can I just follow up on that issue? The reason that the American embassy has been so reluctant, do you think it's simply because they don't want to antagonize the government? I mean, if they let this couple into the United States, what would happen? That would be such a bombshell. Or is it bureaucratic inertia? Or what really is going on that after all these stories in the Times, they wouldn't give this couple visas?
I think it's complicated, but and they've not told me why, so I don't really know.
Do they refuse to tell you?
Yeah. Well, they say that the boilerplate thing, you know, under international law, they have to go to a third country and claim asylum, and they've been unwilling to do that because of the risks involved in doing it, especially now that they have a one-year-old baby. But that's actually bullshit. There are mechanisms for them to give a humanitarian visa and take them. Other countries too, which would actually be, some other countries would be a better solution for them, like Canada, where there's actually a friendly policy toward asylum seekers. They also have turned them down. And I think it's partly because of in very bad security situation. They've all made a determination that we're not going to fight the government on social issues and maybe undermine it with social conservatives at a time when they need those warlords and those old jihadi leaders on their side. And some of them actually, have an awful lot in common theologically or philosophically with the Taliban too. And it's partly that, but also that we've invested so heavily in the country that giving a visa to this couple, and there's some other cases similar to theirs that have also suffered from this. Giving them a visa would be an admission of failure, that all this investment that we've made, the government that we have invested so heavily in, and especially on this issue, is not able to protect two people from being killed. And much as Zakia's family they're not rich, they're not powerful, they're dirt poor farmers too, but they're large and numerous, and they have one thing going for them that makes them very powerful and very dangerous, and that's they know that they could kill her and they will never be prosecuted in Afghanistan, or they certainly won't be penalized in any way for it, and that gives them an awful lot of power, and it makes them an enduring threat. And there are cases of honor killings being carried out 10 years after the fact, and that's something very possible here too.
Just approach the mic if you would. Be great, thanks.
Rod,
Hi, Ron.
known you for about 30 years. The book was really fantastic. I've written
Thanks.
about it, and
Yeah, the publisher loved your blurb.
it was easy to write. I just said, "Wow," and I encourage everyone here, if you go out and buy this book, it's a wonderful book. But a question, to go back to your notion of honor killing. In the book, try to think now, I don't know if you can bring this up as fast as I'm going to ask you. You have a wonderful passage where you really explain in your own words what honor means in these countries, not just as Trudy alluded to, not just Afghanistan, but other countries throughout this whole belt. The notion of honor, which we seem to think is a very simple word, honor. It's a good thing to have honor. But you have a nice passage in the book where you talk about what honor means to Afghanistani men. Can you?
Yeah, informed by a lot of Afghans and very thoughtful Afghans, and also some scholars who have studied this issue. But it really doesn't mean honor as we think of it. Like, honor is besmirched because a woman cheated on her husband or something. It's not about like sexuality even. It's about the concept that women are property of their men, and they're owned by their men, and everything that they do in life is determined by their men. A daughter is the property of her father until she becomes the property of her husband, and if she doesn't have a father or husband, she's the property of her brothers. And the sense that that the man has to determine everything in her life, they actually call that honor, that kind of ownership concept, and it's very strongly held belief and very sort of deeply embedded in, and it does, it is something that's common throughout a large swath of the world, from the Mediterranean. There were honor killings in southern Italy until fairly modern times. And there were honor killings in Iran until 20 years ago, when the Ayatollahs stamped it out and said, this is not Islamic, this is a customary practice that is wrong and needs to end. And most countries have criminalized it, and Afghanistan hasn't, I think at least partly because they've been in the middle of one kind of war or another for 40 years. But yeah, it's very much about the ownership of a woman. Steve,
Please.
sorry.
Rod, when you were helping this couple, why did the enemies of the times think about that? You have to negotiate with them over it, how did that work?
Can you
sure.
repeat the question?
Yeah, he's asking, did I have to negotiate with my editors when I stepped over the line and stopped being a journalist? And I did not, because I didn't tell them. And because if I had told them, they would have told me to stop, and they would have had to, and they knew that. And so I saved them from having that moral dilemma by, making my own decision. I did feel at one point the publisher said, "Do you really want to write about this in your book?" And I said, "Yeah, I think I really do, because their story cannot be explained without, without talking about the intervention of a foreigner and a journalist." that made it possible for them to survive what would have been their fate otherwise. And so I have to talk about it. And so I sent early copies of the book to my boss, the AFPAC editor and the foreign editor, and a few months ago before it came out. And I expected some sort of reaction, but no reaction ever came.
Really?
Yeah, and I'm still waiting for that reaction. I'm not sure of this. But my theory is that, that they're glad I didn't ask them, because they would have had to tell me to stop. And so they're glad that that responsibility wasn't theirs, because the girl would have been killed then. And, you know, we would have shared that responsibility, because I had shared that decision with them. So it sort of worked out, I guess, although the book's only been out a couple of weeks, who knows. But one hopeful note is Arthur Sulzberger asked me for a copy of it. And so I gave him a copy and inscribed it to him very nicely, and said what I said here earlier about their commitment to Afghanistan. So hopefully that'll protect me a little bit, I don't know.
Okay, all in the back.
Just interests me so much that even in these very remote areas of Afghanistan, where of course the whole culture is against romantic love, and yet the music, there is also at the same time a culture of music and story that idealizes romantic love.
Yeah.
Do you have any comment on that at all? I just can't
Well,
understand why these two things.
Those two things are very much in opposition, you're right. And there are mullahs who are, you know, constantly complaining about popular radio and television stations and would like them to stop running things like that. Some of them, the ones that get the most airtime and the most wide circulation are actually stories from the Quran and from the Quranic tradition. Stories like Yusuf and Zuleika, Joseph and Potiphar's wife, and in the Christian or in the Jewish Christian tradition, and that story's in the Quran, and it's a very romantic story, and you know, it's every Ramadan when people are supposed to be praying for the whole month. That story runs as a 30-part serial on Afghan television, and you know, the mullahs can't say anything about it. So there's this kind of conspiracy in the society to try to get around that. At the same time, fathers are so powerful, and their word is so often law that when it comes to marriages, it's hard to get around that. There are cases where people get around it. Sometimes, like especially educated families, will secretly conspire with one another when they know that there's a possibility of a love match. They'll pretend it was arranged and it was a commercial transaction to keep face, to save face with their neighbors and all. But there's a couple examples of that in the book as well. But generally speaking, people, you know, fall in love, you know, and then they get married and put that aside. It's quite sad.
Okay, I'm going to take a last question from one of our students up front.
I was going to say, why did you choose the passage to read that you chose?
I just think it's the most touching passage in the book, actually. And it was, it had a little bit of that poetry, some other sections didn't, and it was a pretty important moment in their life, you know, where their relationship became more than just talking to each other.
I want to thank our guests. I want to thank the Inquirer for hosting us. Thank you. We had a gentleman suggest that you go out and buy the book, but you actually don't have to go out and buy the book. They're right over here. And Rod will be signing them for anybody who is interested. Thank you. We're adjourned.